One of the great privileges in organizing a conference like this is that you can invite the people you most respect to speak. So it is my great honor to introduce three of America's top thinkers on China to talk about the future of US-China relations, US-China 3.0. I usually don't spend too much time on introductions, but in this case, I think it's really important for you all to understand the depth and breadth of knowledge that these three speakers bring to the conversation. Stapleton Roy has had many, many titles in his stellar diplomatic and business career. But what you need to know today is, number one, that he was posted to Beijing twice and served as US ambassador there from 1991 to 1995. And number two, that his knowledge and understanding dates back to his earliest years in Nanjing, where he was born the son of a Presbyterian missionary. He lived in China until he was a teenager and left in 1949. I can attest to the fact that the ambassador still speaks impeccable Chinese. During our prep call, he quoted, with perfect tones, I might add, from some of the vitriolic language used by the Chinese media to describe recent US policies. Susan Shirk has equally powerful China chops. Today, she is chair of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California in San Diego. A longtime China expert, Susan served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Clinton administration. Susan has been at this China work for a long time too. She first traveled to China in 1971 as a member of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, and she has written many books about China, including China, Fragile Superpower, how China's internal politics could derail its peaceful rise. And more recently, through a series of closed-door, high-level symposiums, Susan has been instrumental in driving a deep policy conversation among America's top China experts about how to address increasing concerns about security and China's rise. Leading this conversation will be Orville Schell, who is director of the Center on US-China Relations at the Asia Society, and I'm proud to say a very dear and old friend. As I was reading Orville's bio over the weekend, I marveled at his incredibly multi-storied career as a China scholar, as a prominent journalist, as a farmer, an environmental expert, as an author and public intellectual. Orville was already a full-fledged China scholar with many degrees by the time he took his first trip to China in 1974 during the middle of the Cultural Revolution. He worked for a month at the Dachai model commune and went on to write countless pieces about China for the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books and many other publications. Orville is the author of no fewer than 16 extremely influential books on China. I think it's fair to say that these three Americans know China like no one else does. Thank you all for joining us today. Over to you, Orville.
Well, thank you, Dinda, and it's really nice to be here with Stape and Susan. I think we'd all agree that we are at something of a moment, an inflection point, where attitudes have changed dramatically, both within China and in America, and that the old operating system, if you will, that really served us quite ably for many, many decades, which came to be known ultimately as engagement, has really run its course. And I think the challenge we confront as two nations, and indeed the world confronts it, and we confront it here on this discussion today, is if in fact engagement has run its course, what would a post-engagement form of engagement look like? Because China is not going to vanish. And we have to figure out what the sort of equation is between engagement, between embracing China, dealing with China, working with China, and to arrogate those areas where we feel we cannot engage. And that is the process that I think we confront here today. So let me ask both of you, and maybe start with you, Stape. You have both been at the very sort of center of the United States' effort ever since 1972 to bring China out of its sort of Maoist revolutionary period into some other guise, into some other form, and moreover to bring it into the world as it existed outside of China, to make it more soluble. I wonder how you look back on that those decades of engagement. Was it a success? Was it a failure? Were we justified in trying it? Is it still relevant in some way? How do you historically look at it, Stape? And then we'll move to you, Susan.
Orville, that's a key question. The short answer is we broke through to China in 1971-72 for a very specific purpose, which was President Nixon recognized that the clashes between Chinese interests and Soviet interests had reached the point of military clashes on their borders. And he saw an opportunity that nobody else saw, which was to use his personal prestige as president to convince Chairman Mao that he ought to switch and establish a relationship with the United States. If you read our intelligence from that period, we all recognized the differences between China and the Soviet Union. We all saw that we were not gaining any benefit from that because we had a bad relationship with China, but only President Nixon saw that using his personal prestige would enable us to get a breakthrough. It was successful beyond our belief, so that we essentially turned China onto our side in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. I was in Moscow at that time, not working on US-China relations, and the Soviets were absolutely devastated by what had happened. So it was unbelievably successful. But we had to resolve the handling of Taiwan. We were the only country in the world in which Taiwan was a major factor for us, and it took us 6 years to work out how to handle Taiwan, and we succeeded and established diplomatic relations in 1979. Unknown to us, Deng Xiaoping was planning at that time to switch to economic policies of reform and openness. So there was an enormous boost given to the bilateral relationship by the fact that China needed cooperation with us in order to ensure the success of its reform and openness policies, and we needed cooperation with China to deal with the Soviet threat, which existed right until the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. So the early phases of the engagement with China were a stunning success. But then things changed. The Soviet threat vanished. China had domestic problems because of its opening up. And we had the Tiananmen massacre carried on primetime television that turned attitudes in the United States hostile toward China. I went to China's ambassador under those circumstances. And the big problem was the American people did not want improved relations with China. And it's hard to manage a bilateral relationship when people don't want what is in the national interest to have, because we had lots of areas where we needed cooperation with China. We began to work our way out of that by the end of that decade. But it took a while for us to recognize that China required an engagement policy even without the Soviet threat to justify it. And by the time of the second Bush administration, we had made that transition. But then China, because of the success of its economic policies, and because it was raising its military budget and modernizing its military rapidly, began to emerge as our principal strategic rival. And that's the situation we're in now. And quite frankly, from the president on down, Americans are not sure how we should be dealing with China, because we see them as a rival. Attitudes in both the United States and China have turned hostile toward the other country. We're both the most consequential two countries in the world, but we're both mismanaging our foreign relations and our domestic affairs. China has is cracking down on its population. It's taking away the freedom of expression that they enjoyed for much of the last 4 decades. They have a major separatism problem that isn't recognized adequately in the United States. And that's driving their policy in ways that are causing foreign countries, including their neighbors, to react more negatively to them. But when we look at the polls of international attitudes, we find the same phenomenon affecting the United States. That attitudes toward the United States are also turning more negative in Europe and in Asia. So both of us are, shall we say, not managing our domestic affairs, our foreign affairs, or our bilateral relations well. And the fact of the matter, in my judgment, is that the necessity of having a workable relationship with China is more important now than ever before. We talk as though war is a potential option. It's not. We would destroy each other if 2 nuclear powers get into a war with each other. We recognized that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Why don't we recognize that now? War is not an option with China. We might have limited military conflicts with China, but we cannot have a major military engagement with China without putting our entire countries at risk of destruction. So this is a very important issue. And at the moment, we need a better way of managing the bilateral relationship than we have at the moment.
Well, thank you, Stape. So Susan, you came into this as a diplomat in the Clinton years when Stape has just described the logic of engagement from 1972, which was, of course, the Soviet Union. But beginning with the Clinton administration, there was a new kind of a logic that arose, and that was that if we engage China through market forces, that open markets would ultimately tend to lead towards more open societies, a more congenial kind of convergence. If that, in fact, sort of operating system is now also gone, what is the logic then of getting together with China and working with China? Well, what's the basis that we could reweave some sort of bilateral fabric that has eluded us?
Well, thanks, Orville, and it's really an honor to be on the panel here with Stape and you, and thanks to Dinda for inviting us. You know, the COVID pandemic was a real shock to me in that I suddenly realized how hostile US-China relations had become. In the past, even when we had some pretty heated disputes with China, we managed to work together on global public health threats. We did it in H1N1, we did it with Ebola, actually even going back to SARS in 2003, we started. And yet now with this absolutely terrible threat to the health of everyone on the planet, we weren't able to even manage the two sides. The governments weren't able to manage even a minimal amount of coordinating effort. So it seems to me that this was kind of a test for US-China relations that we failed very, very badly. And the rationale for some cooperation between the US and China is right in front of our noses. It is global threats like public health and also climate change, and not blowing one another up, nuclear non-proliferation and cooperation so that we manage to stabilize our relations and prevent other countries from having weapons of mass destruction that could could lead to a kind of nuclear war or chemical or biological war. So yes, it's true that the domestic changes in China have been really very complex, and there's been a lot of going backwards, especially since Xi Jinping came into power. It's pretty depressing to see some of the practices that had been used in the bad old days of the Mao era coming back under Xi Jinping. Rectification campaigns, ideological education. I mean, of course, a lot of these things never entirely disappeared, but they had diminished in significance, and now they're coming back with vengeance. So what do we do about that? We have, first of all, recognize that the situation in China, the debates over what's the best way to govern China and how should the country get along with the United States and other countries, it's a lot more contested than people realized. People outside of China see it as a monolith. But in fact, there's a lot of sub rosa debate. Of course, it can't be said openly, but a lot of people are not very happy, especially at the elite level, intellectuals, journalists, people in government as well, about the way Xi Jinping is governing China. So the future is still kind of a work in progress. We don't really know. And Stape always points out, whenever I have the good fortune to be on a panel with him, that China's middle class is really the wild card. You know, it has this large middle class, it's quite cosmopolitan. People often want to send their children abroad, especially the United States, to study. And do they really want to go back to the days when their children are spending more time learning Xi Jinping thought in school than they are learning the things that will help them pursue their education and even potentially a career abroad? So, and the other wild card is the relations between Xi and other members of the Chinese Communist Party elite, because he has concentrated power in his own hands in a way that means no power sharing with the others. That's not, in the long term, a stable situation. So from the standpoint of the United States and other countries, it's very difficult because this is still kind of a black box, domestic politics. But we need to recognize that there are still a lot of imponderables, a lot of things that are difficult to predict about the future. And that's why, in addition to being outspoken in our criticisms of China, being quite tough in our policies toward China, we also have to create a kind of off-ramp. We have to reassure the Chinese decision makers that if they're willing to make compromises and bend and engage in some give and take, then we're prepared to negotiate and to work together to stabilize relations so we don't blow one another up and we stabilize this very important relationship.
You know, we talk rather blithely about decoupling as if it were limited to supply chains and trade, but in actuality, it seems to me it's now beginning to infect almost every aspect of the relationship. Not only does the pandemic prevent us from traveling, but we don't have cultural exchanges now. Civil society has come to an almost complete stop, not simply because of the pandemic, but because of policies within China. Diplomacy is much more amputated than it was before. Even educational and scholarly exchanges now are challenged. It strikes me that there is that decoupling as a metaphor is echoing throughout the entire relationship, even I might say in terms of our friendships with people in China. We seem to be having sort of muscular atrophy of all of the subsidiary ways in which we interact, which transcend by an enormous bound the trade question. How do you two look at our ability to restore some of those other aspects of the relationship?
do you want Stape to start? Do you want
Go ahead, you start, Susan. You look like you're about to have something you want to say.
Well, I mean, you know, all of us, probably many of the people who have joined in this conversation today, are feeling how personally distraught about this and how wrenching it is, because many of us, you know, do have kind of one leg in China and one leg in the United States. I mean, it's tragic, especially to see Chinese Americans and ethnic Chinese who may not yet be Americans, who's especially scientists and engineers who are now being viewed as suspect because they've helped train students in China under one of these talent programs, or maybe just in something they worked out with a college classmate. So it's really a terrible situation, and one that I think we have to work very, very hard to prevent it from going any further. And this is important for US interests. You know, I believe that, especially under the Trump administration, we're becoming more like China. We're in a kind of race to the bottom to see who can be more restrictive, close off things, more protectionist, build up more barriers. And instead, but that's not what America is all about. And it's certainly not the source of American competitiveness. The reason that the US has to double down on openness, even while engaging in some risk mitigation efforts, for sure, related to security. But openness is what makes America so great, because there's no other country in the world that can operate in this global knowledge economy the way the United States can, because we have a distinctive asymmetric advantage to attract talent from around the world. Everybody wants to come and study at our universities. And they want to stay here because we've got a legal system, we have a way of life that's very attractive to people from around the world. So instead of trying to exclude talent from China and scrutinize it so closely and make people from China feel that they are enemies, we really need to double down on our openness. And because otherwise, for sure, we'll lose the science and technology contest with China. And that has become really a central point of competition between the two countries.
Stape, if openness is a sort of the tonic that will, you know, bring the two countries together in some measure, doesn't China also have a responsibility here? And we often, I think Americans tend to get in a habit of flagellating themselves as if they alone could solve every problem. But by the old sort of Confucian, you know, notion of shoushan, or self-reflection, self-cultivation, doesn't China have a lot of work to do here to, if we ever expect this relationship to have any sort of health again?
Yes, it does. I agree with everything that Susan said, but I would like to focus on two areas which need to be addressed. We're not simply in a military competition with China. We're in a much broader competition with China. You could call it a systemic competition, if you will. But here's the problem. We are running unprecedented budget deficits at the moment. We are going to have, you know, we've been drifting along with deficits approximating $1 trillion a year. We've now tripled that or quadrupled that, and there's no end in sight. China's political system is able to extract more resources from their economy than we are able to extract from ours. So that China is funding massively, not only its military, but also the non-military components of its comprehensive national power. And we are pouring all of our money into the military. And we have discovered in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other places, there are no military solutions to a lot of the problems that we face in the world. China has a Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which they're offering port and transportation and telecommunications projects all over the world, and we have nothing comparable to that. So we need to think about the economic consequences of having an unrestricted competition with China in which we're only funding our military. But the second problem is successful foreign policies rest on your ability to link your national interests to the national interests of other countries. And here China is totally different from the Soviet Union. China's economy has not only been the driver of regional growth in recent decades, but of global growth. And that means that we are dealing with foreign countries who have major economic interests with China, no matter how China is behaving. So at the moment, our foreign policy is simply out of tune with the friends and allies whose cooperation we need in order to compete successfully with China. For example, Asian countries have reacted very negatively to China's wolf warrior type of diplomacy and their assertiveness and their arrogance in dealing with their neighbors. And this is a problem. China is having diplomatic conferences to try to figure out how they can do better in that respect. But we're not gaining the benefits because we're demanding that our friends and allies in Asia make a choice between us or China, and they don't want to make a choice. That includes Japan, South Korea, Thailand, other key countries like this, Indonesia. They don't want to make a choice because their economies are heavily involved with China's economy.
Yeah.
So we need to gear our foreign policy to linking our interests and our approaches to gaining benefits from the national interests of other countries whose cooperation we need for a successful foreign policy. But at the moment, we are totally neglecting foreign policy and over-relying on military power that we can no longer afford to get into a major arms race with China. So here's the problem. China will not accept American dominance in the Western Pacific of the sort that we used to have. And they have already successfully eroded that. If our goal is to retain our military dominance, we will be in a costly arms race that will pour money into weapon systems that is too dangerous to use in a major confrontation. So you need diplomacy in order to deal with that problem, and we don't have it. The second problem we need to deal with is Taiwan.
If I could interrupt you there for just a sec, do you think the Chinese side has it?
Well, China has made a massive mistake because they are defining their military requirements, not simply in terms of their defense needs, but in terms of their status as an international country. And both at the 18th and the 19th Party Congresses, they used language suggesting that they need a world-class military when they don't have world-class responsibilities. So they have defined their defense needs in an unacceptable way for their neighbors and for the rest of the world. And that's a problem in terms of what they are doing. But from our standpoint, our problem is we're thinking in terms of dominance in a region where we can no longer have that type of dominance and achieve a stable international system.
Well, State, maybe they build the world-class military, then they will have the global activity to match it.
They have the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
They ought to be looking at Japan. Japan became an enormously influential country in the world, sitting on all of the top bodies in the world, and it had a non-world-class military.
Now that's a very interesting model, but it seems to me that there is some logic that I'd like you to address, that dependency, whether it's in supply chains or whatever, depends on an assessment that the threat from the person or the country you're dependent on is not that enormous. Now, if you look at the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and the East China Sea, it seems to me that there's a reasonably high risk of some kind of a clash. So if that is in fact a reality, then what degree of dependence makes sense for the United States?
It's not really.
Orville, go ahead, Susan.
Well, no, you go ahead. I was just.
Well,
say,
let me just make
the
point I want to make is this: supply chains reflect economic realities.
Yeah.
They aren't artificial constructs. If you reorder global supply chains, you will have higher costs and lower efficiency. What we have discovered in using the wrong tools, namely tariffs, is that the supply chains are remodeling themselves, but they're not bringing the production facilities back to the United States. They're simply shifting to other countries who also have interests with China. So the way to deal with the security problems you talk about is through the mechanisms of technology controls. We've always had those, but those need to be modernized to deal with the current problems. You don't deal with it through tariffs. You deal with, and China has the same restrictions in place in terms of what they can export or not export to the rest of the world. I think our economic approach globally and specifically to China is absolutely crazy. The sooner we can get rid of the tariffs, frankly, the better off we'll be.
By the way, the current effort in China to strengthen self-reliance because of the risks that we have created to their economy by our hostile political approach to China, I think will be actually quite costly to China. It will, and it won't necessarily work. If you read now about, for example, the race to become self-reliant in advanced semiconductors, there's something like 80,000 companies that do all sorts of businesses. They're jumping into the effort, they're jumping on the bandwagon to try to get government subsidies, government support by jumping into the semiconductor business. This is not going to work very well. It's going to be extremely costly. And I think, as Stape says, supply chains reflect economic reality. Do we really want a US government trying to tell our companies where they can and cannot set up manufacturing operations? This will, I mean, this is not the American market economy that has been so successful over centuries. And I don't think it's going to work. I think that one reason that people have really kind of panicked about supply chains right now is because of COVID and the fact that we are not able to supply our own medical equipment. Well, that does suggest maybe we should be doing a little bit more of that to prepare for emergencies. But does it really mean that we should pursue self-reliance in all of these other economic sectors? It absolutely makes no sense at all.
Well, I think the challenge is to kind of winnow out those few critical areas where we do feel there's a national security challenge, and that is a process we certainly haven't begun with any great thoroughness. Let me raise another question, and we'll start with Stape. Although Susan, you were the one who made the comment. You were quoted in the Financial Times the other day as being somewhat skeptical that if the door was open and this leads into the possibility of a new administration, that the Chinese leaders would be able to walk through it. So Stape, let me start with you. Do you think that Chinese leadership is capable of embracing a major diplomatic initiative that would come to terms with some of the things that are bedeviling us, if not finding a kind of reset button? What's your assessment of their ability to respond? Let's assume the Americans make a good diplomatic gesture and are willing to kind of work things out again.
I think they would respond favorably, and they indicated. I'm not just saying that, out of nowhere. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has given a major speech recently in which he essentially left the door open for more engagement. Yang Jiechi, who's on the Politburo and was the former foreign minister, also gave a speech in which he hit on the same themes. I don't think that we ourselves have the domestic base in the United States right now for a major re-engagement with China. I think we have to work our way back in that direction. And if we are prepared to explore how to start dealing with issues, including our key economic issues with China, where I think the diplomatic approach is better than the approach of saying, if you don't do this, I will sanction you. Sanctions are one of the worst tools in diplomacy in terms of accomplishing what you want to do. Diplomacy is much more effective. Sanctions are a last resort. When diplomacy fails, they're not a substitute for diplomacy. And I think that we would find that there's a willingness on China's part to re-engage, partly because China has long-term goals which we don't have. And China's goals of where they want to be in 2035 and 2049 are unattainable if they have a bad relationship with the United States. And so I think there's a strategic reason behind their desire for cooperation with the United States. And I think we have a strategic reason for cooperation with China. At the moment, that's obscured by the hostility that we're displaying toward China, but that doesn't remove the fact that both of us would benefit from a stable, prosperous East Asia that's not polarized between pro-China and pro-US countries.
So Susan, maybe what's your response apropos of your quote? Do you think Chinese core interests, which means that it's very difficult to give and take and to conduct any meaningful diplomacy, stand in the way of the Chinese walking through a door should the Americans come to their senses and be able to open that door?
Well, I keep watching to see signs of restraint and flexibility on the Chinese side. And recently I have seen a couple that are a bit encouraging. One is that Beijing has signed on to the global vaccine consortium that's under the WHO. Previously, the United States, China, and Russia were the countries not joining in. China has now decided to join in this effort to share vaccine with poor countries that will need help in getting it. Meanwhile, the United States still sits outside and in fact is, under the Trump administration, says it's going to quit the WHO. So that's a kind of constructive cooperation effort on China's part. Similarly, with debt negotiation, renegotiation, there are some signs that China is participating in the G20 effort to renegotiate its debt to developing countries, which is among the largest in the world. So, I mean, that's not enough. But these are signs that they recognize that their diplomacy has failed to win them friends and in fact made them new enemies, and they're trying to set a different tone for the future. In terms of relations with the United States, Right now, I think they're kind of lying low. They do not want to poke Donald Trump. They recognize he's a very volatile, unpredictable leader, and they want to somehow get through the election without some crisis in US-China relations. But do they have the pragmatic gene? Does Xi Jinping have the pragmatic gene that Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao had? I'm not really sure. And I definitely am worried about that. But so we'll have to wait and see. But I guess the way I sometimes put it to myself, I haven't entirely given up on China or even Xi Jinping. And I think he is sensitive to costs that China is enduring because of the international backlash. Of course, the question is he getting accurate information because of having created this over-concentration of power in the system? Or is everyone just telling him what he wants to hear? And that's something we really don't know the answer to. We've got to test it.
Now, it sometimes almost seems that we're back in an earlier period where the best way to get information in is not directly through Chinese, but a ricochet shot through the media, through events like this that going in directly.
Absolutely. And our Chinese friends will say that to us, right? They say, why don't you write something about that? Because the Chinese leadership will read it. They're dubious about their own ability to influence policy, but they think somehow maybe foreign experts might have better luck.
All right, let's turn just for a moment here. One way or the other, we do have an election, and we're either going to have a new administration or a second Trump administration. Let's get both of you to sort of ruminate for a moment on how might a Biden administration be different. And also, I think it's important to ask that same question about a second Trump administration. Once he didn't have to get elected, what might we expect from him that would surprise us?
I think a Biden administration would be different because if I were to prioritize, I would say that a new administration, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, should give top priority to restoring the health of our alliances. Because our alliance system is something China doesn't have and won't be able to develop easily. And it gives us an edge if we know how to use it. At the moment, we're abusing it rather than using it properly. And I think that a Biden administration will adopt a multilateral approach and get away from the America first type of bilateralism, that you can't be a leader if no one will follow you. And that's exactly how we are positioning ourselves at the moment. So that I think there will be a difference in the Biden administration. But I think that if they restore the health of our alliances, they will discover that our alliances want us to adopt a different approach to China. And that will be a major factor in enabling us to feel our way back toward a more constructive relationship with Beijing.
Dinda, I imagine you're wanting us to get into questions. Well, let's take a question. One questioner asks about Taiwan. What is the best roadmap to support a vibrant democracy in Taiwan and yet not run the train off the tracks?
I'll leave that to Stape, the master.
I'll take a politically incorrect approach on that. We have a phrase in the United States: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We had a non-broken framework for stabilizing the Taiwan factor in our relations with China. It was worked out during the normalization talks, and Taiwan went from a rice-producing, can-apple pining country to a place that has a per capita GDP that ranks right after Sweden and Germany. It's ahead of Italy and Britain and a bunch of other European countries. And under most of that period, tensions in the Taiwan Strait were low. And the United States, throughout that period, right up until the Trump administration, made it crystal clear that we wanted Taiwan to stay within a one China framework. Now that framework began to come loose in 2016 when we thought that Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan had worked out a formula close enough to an acknowledgement that they would preserve a status quo that was consistent with one China rather than trying to break loose from it. But Tsai Ing-wen refused to make any reference to one China, and China responded by showing a total lack of confidence in her. So the Chinese pressure was not originated by China, it was originated by Tsai Ing-wen. Now, a lot of people don't agree with me on this, but this happens to be an issue I've been deeply engaged with over the years. And this is the way the Chinese look at it. At the moment, trying to introduce more officiality into our relations with Taiwan guarantees a crisis. It's a question of not whether, but when. And the Taiwanese know this better than us. For example, if you read the Taiwan press, you will read articles there saying, what in the world are we doing? We don't want a military confrontation with the mainland. You know, the United States won't come to our assistance if we do.
So then, Stape, how do you support Taiwan, best support it and evince your support for their ongoing democracy without raising the specter of some military clash?
Well, we've been doing that successfully right until the current administration. Essentially, Taiwan was prospering.
There's anything that needs to be added to the formula?
Quite frankly, I think at the moment, the problem is that we are outside the formula. And the question is, I think that if we stabilize the framework that has been sanctioned by 8 previous presidents, that you can continue having a highly productive relationship with Taiwan that doesn't put us into a confrontational relationship with China. If our approach is a salami slicing tactic of gradually increasing the officiality of our relationship with Taiwan, there will be a crisis. Now, that's not necessarily true 25 or 30 years from now, but that's what our Taiwan policy should be designed for. We should have a middle of the century Taiwan policy designed to wait and see what happens. At the moment, peaceful resolution is not an option. But it's the only way to resolve the problem. And therefore, we need a policy that buys us the time necessary to see whether that type of an option is achievable.
I'd like to jump in if I may.
Sure.
With apologies for interrupting, but we have to be respectful of time. But I do want to ask one last question, which is also coming from the audience, which, you know, this is a business conference, right? But business is connected to everything that goes on in both China and the United States. So one of the people is asking, you know, Ambassador Roy, you talked about building the base, the American base, that it's going to be very hard to kind of build the case again for re-engagement and for, you know, getting back to a better scenario. So I'd love for both of you, as your final comments, Susan and Stape, to talk a little bit about what's your advice for the business community? You know, what's the message what should they be doing to try to get things back on course, and how do we build a base in America or rebuild a base for a more positive relationship?
Well, I'm not as worried about the constraint of public opinion in the United States as many other people are. If you look at surveys about what are the most important issues that are affecting you as you cast your vote in this election, turns out China's at the bottom. They're not at the top. China's not that important to people right now. And I think that it will be possible for a new administration to kind of lead public opinion toward a more practical and less ideological approach to China. The business community is critical. And here's where the leadership in Beijing has a tremendous opportunity, because traditionally, the American business community has been the key constituency for engagement with China. But they are disaffected because they now have felt over the past decade or so that they are not competing on a level playing field in China, and there is a lot of bias and protectionism against them. So they, if Beijing can adjust its economic policies in a way that treats foreign business fairly, that also will probably be the kind of economic policy that will treat the private sector in China fairly, which has not been the case over the past decade or so. And that's going to be good for China's economic growth. So, and it'll be very good for rebuilding the foundation for support for stabilizing relations with China, not just in the United States, but also in other advanced industrial countries.
Ambassador
Susan
Roy,
has put it very well. You need to have the domestic base for your foreign policy, or you can't implement it. And many presidents make the mistake of talking domestically in ways that undermine the foreign policies that they want to carry out. And Chinese leaders have made the same type of mistake if you read their domestic media. So that it's important that there be consistency between the two. And what the business communities want, based on my experience in dealing with them, is they want predictability. They can't make business decisions if 6 months or a year from now, the US government may be taking some actions that pull the rug out from under them. So they would like a sense of order in the way that we deal with China on business matters. They don't want the threat that suddenly a tariff will be put on them or a new restriction put on them somehow. They want a sense of predictability, and then they'll make their business decisions the way they ought to be made without government interference.
so I want to thank you all so much. I'm sorry I jumped in, Orville, just because of, in the interest of time, but this has just been amazing. We are so honored to have the three of you, offer some conclusions and insights at the end of our conference. So thank you so much for that.